Someone said that frickin' Panera's Pepsi's taste funny.
Better.
No, I mean,
What? Welcome, everyone, to this week's admittedly late episode of the Average Intelligence Podcast. As always, I am Jake, one of your hosts, through various reasons. So this episode was actually supposed to be done a couple weeks ago. Family things keep coming up, and then on Wednesday, I even had to take the day off because I'm celebrating my mother's birthday. Happy birthday again, Mom. And then, so this video was supposed to be something completely different, but this just so happened to be one of the crazier weeks I've ever had. So I had to make a decision as I was trying to get this video formatted properly. And ultimately, I decided to convert this into a more of a reaction video, although I've already seen this, so more of a dissection, if you will. But by the nature of the change of this program leads me to my first plea with everyone is if you haven't already, please like the video, like and watch our other videos, share, subscribe, and most importantly, go back and watch some of our older episodes because we've got to get our watch time up so that we can get monetized. And then we will have the ability to create even more and better content for you guys. Because I got a lot of ideas. My only limitation, and I know Eric's got a lot of ideas too, our only limitation is time. And because we still have to have our normal everyday 40 plus hours a week day jobs, this unfortunately does suffer sometimes, and this is an example, but I promise you, I'm going to do the best I possibly can. But before we dig into that, I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsors of tonight's podcast, our friends at TikTok and Arate Media. We'll hear about both of those a little bit later, but now let's get to Jordan Peterson surrounded by 20 atheists. Okay, so before we start the video, I want to let everybody know two things up front. First of all, as the title suggests, this is me somewhat defending Jordan Peterson on this video because it's no secret I'm a Jordan Peterson fan. However, I don't think he's perfect. There are some things in this video that I will be criticizing, but the biggest thing about this particular appearance on Jubilee is that a lot of people are criticizing Peterson in ways that I don't think are fair. And as I'll point out several times in this video, what you have to understand about what Peterson is doing here, you must remember Jordan Peterson is a psychologist and a college professor. His whole deal is teaching people how to think and construct ideas. And in just about every conversation he has, actually, if I rephrase it, in every conversation he is either fostering that or he is through the dialogue trying to teach someone how to better their concepts. So, with that in mind, I still maintain, and I think Dr. Peterson would agree with me. I don't know him, but I've had the pleasure of seeing him speak live. I think he would agree with me when I say that Peterson is not so much trying to convert atheists or even prove them wrong necessarily. He's trying to get them to think about what they believe in and why they believe in it. So, with that frame of mind, let's dig into the video.
Hello there, I'm Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'm a
Hello.
clinical psychologist, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto,
Professor.
an author, a podcaster, public speaker, and today I'm surrounded by 25 atheists.
Now, I do want to mention real quick before we get back into it. There's a criticism, and you can even see in the title in the upper left, Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheists. That was not the original title of the video. In fact, even when it was first released, I believe it was one Christian versus 20 atheists. And this is important because it became very clear as the video goes along that Jordan Peterson is not necessarily identifying himself as a Christian here. And one of the particularly snarky atheists in the circle kind of I'll get to it, but just understand that the video wasn't originally Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheists. It was one Christian versus 20 atheists.
My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
My background is in studying to become a traditional Catholic priest, daily mass, daily rosary, going on long retreats, deep into the magisterium and biblical hermeneutics. Like, I was thoroughly in it. And it seems like I do know what I'm missing. Is there something that I missed over years of study, both this issue formally and living out religion so deeply?
Well, you obviously feel that you missed something when you were practicing for the priesthood. Your aim was off then. So there's always the possibility that it's still off now.
What was off about my aim in the first place?
I don't know. That might take a long time to figure out. But
Then it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how.
Okay. The no true Scotsman fallacy. So the no true Scotsman fallacy, I forget, it has another name, but it's essentially moving the goalposts of a definition. So the example they give is um, someone will say Scotsmen don't eat porridge or something to that line, and then somebody else says, well, my grandfather was from Scotland and he eats porridge, and then the person who made the initial claim says, well, no true Scotsman eats porridge. One thing you'll see, not just in this video, but in Surrounded, I really don't like the format of Surrounded. It's not productive. I get it. It gets clicks, but in terms of having a productive discussion, it very rarely serves. First of which, the format itself, because somebody can be voted out in the middle of a discussion, it's counterproductive. And everybody who they get, you'll notice they tend to get a lot of the same people. Everybody's just trying to get a viral moment. And I'll touch on one in particular, and that motivation does skew the discussion somewhat. This guy you'll see, and also you'll see a lot of these people, which by the way, if you're watching this, I'm not showing you the entire video. I'm showing you the highlights that I'm going to talk about. I highly recommend that you check out the original video on Jubilee, but you will see not everybody in the atheist camp, but most of them are not so much trying to polish their ideas or have what I would even call a legitimate debate. They're just, again, they're trying to win an argument. And when you go, sometimes you do have to go into a debate like that, particularly like presidential debates come to mind. But typically, you want to go into a debate wanting to learn or at the very least test your ideas, right? So very few of them are doing this, but Peterson seems to be in a way doing that, but sometimes he does get a little, he does move the goalposts occasionally, but anyway, we'll get back into the discussion, but I just wanted to touch on that, the no true Scotsman fallacy.
there's a sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded with a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that God is characterized in the Old Testament stories.
Yes.
Now, Moses is a faithful servant of God and a good man. At least that's the case within the confines of the story.
One possible
It's
interpretation.
the case within the confines of the story, obviously. But
Well,
there's
not obviously.
there's
When we look at the Bible can't precisely say anything because there are so many different
Oh.
exegetical and hermeneutic views of this particular book, and that everybody has agreed or everybody has disagreed historically
forgot
on.
about
It seems like
this part.
even the most benign detail about a book this big, and it seems like you can only say that the Bible says something if you first presuppose that it's univocal.
So your claim essentially is that Moses in the Old Testament plays the role of a villain or is irrelevant? Because the alternative claim
I'm
is
saying that we
he's
can't
good.
know because we
that's-
can't talk to those
look,
authors.
If you
This is something that, and it's not just atheists, this is something that to me a lot of academic types do, is they will, what do I want to say? They'll over detail or over analyze to the point where the discussion becomes unproductive. And his point, first of all, his point is flat out wrong. And Peterson defeats that claim very soundly by saying, like, wait, he said it right there. You're suggesting that Moses is the villain of the book of Exodus, So his claim that nothing in the Bible is, I guess, universally recognized because you have to talk to the author. I mean, that's patently absurd. Like, you can have fun with that discussion, something like the Karate Kid, right? But even people understand that's a joke. Like Peterson rightly points out, no, there are absolutely things in the Bible that, whether you believe them or not to be true, we can all agree that the book says that. For example, in the Gospels, Jesus is crucified, dies, is buried, and rises again on the third day. there's no interpretation of that because it is point blank said. And just like Peterson points out, Moses would not have been granted the I guess the privilege of a glimpse of the divine if he did not deserve it, right? So to that point, Peterson's when and you see what he's doing though. He's trying to get I forget the guy's name, which is sad because I'm watching it, but he's trying to get him to analyze his own arguments and basically learn how to reason his own way. And he's trying to show him how to reason his way through the argument and get rid of all the dead wood of it, so to speak. And it continues.
I mean, the problem is that when we look at, famously, when you've been asked, do you believe in God? The question becomes, what do we mean by God? And in the Bible, it's not even clear the biblical authors know what God is, because Yahweh has historically emerged from an early storm god, a deity that doesn't exhaust the category of deity, and that has changed over the Old Testament. Does God have physicality? Does God not have physicality?
No. Okay, no. Well, it's not a flat out no, but here, okay, there's something that you have to understand about the Old Testament, and this is something that I learned in college, specifically through this book, The Hebrew Bible by John J. Collins. Fantastic book, but as you can see, it's quite long, and you will need to take notes. I recommend color coding for your own sanity. Um, what you learn, though, is that the Old Testament is made up of mainly two different schools of thought, or traditions rather, of the nature of God, right? And those are the Yahwist tradition, which is the more sort of literal old man, sometimes on earth, sometimes in the sky. And the story that Peterson's talking about, where I don't know if this is in our video because I haven't chopped it up yet. Um, but Peterson mentions the moment where Moses is granted a glimpse at the divine, and my college professor kind of tongue-in-cheekily referred to it as God showing Moses his ass because Moses sees his back. That part of the story, and you have to understand, many of the books of the Old Testament, including Genesis and Exodus, are made up of a mix of the Yahwist tradition and then the other tradition, which is the Elohist tradition, which is more of the non-corporeal. If I'm remembering this correctly, it's been a minute. It's been how long is it? It's been a couple decades, I think. But so you can usually tell if you don't know for a fact, you can usually tell the difference between them when God is spoken of or even appears. If God appears physically manifest, it's a Yahwist sort of story or part of the story. And then if it's more of the non-corporeal um, kind of version, that's usually Elohist, which interestingly enough, Elohim, you may have heard that before. The prefix El does mean God in various languages. And that's where we get Eli, Elijah. That's where we get a lot of those names from. But yes, so the Elohist comes from Elohim. So this atheist person is referring to contradictory tellings, and it can read that way, but you have to understand that when they were compiling these scriptures together, they were taking various parts of many, many writings to create their canon. So that explains the why it can be jarring. It's also why there's two tellings of the creation story in Genesis. One is the Elohist. I believe the first one is the Elohist, and then the Yahwist follows it up.
Claims.
A central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
No,
Is that...
I said that we were finite and we had to establish a relationship with the infinite.
Yeah, then in that case, then we're all religious, but then I can do the same thing and define one particular...
I think that Peterson, actually, I think he makes that claim, though. I think he would make the case that everyone is religious to a certain degree, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're a Christian, if that makes sense. Peterson often plays with this idea of people worshiping something, even though it's not in the traditional religious sense, and I believe he touches on it later.
Yeah.
Tell me everything that you know about the Polynesian deity Lono, L-O-N-O.
I don't know anything about the Polynesian deity Lono.
So you're rejecting something without knowledge of what you're rejecting.
I'm not rejecting it.
Do
no
you
more
be-
than I'm
Do
rejecting
you believe in
anything that
Lono?
I don't know anything
Do you
about.
believe in Lono?
I
Do you
fail to
believe
see
that
the
he is a
relevance of
deity
that.
that exists in the world?
I absolutely, regardless of what the debate or discussion is about, I hate when people do this thing, when they're trying to set a trap. But this is a particularly bad one. And Peterson, will take him to school for it in just a second. He's trying to get Peterson to reject Lono. But Peterson's first reaction is, I don't know anything about Lono, and I can't reject what I don't know about. I can't reject something that I fundamentally don't understand. And Peterson's claim, this person admittedly is getting confused because he's taking Peterson's claim that atheists reject God. The problem is that those are definitionally two different things, right? Peterson is not rejecting Lono outright because he doesn't know anything about Lono. Now, upon further examination, he probably would, but that's kind of irrelevant to this point in the discussion because it's a defense or an argument against Peterson's claim. Now, the way I would view this is because I believe that claim is correct, by the way. I do believe that many atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting, right? And I would liken that to, or not liken that, I would reflect on that sort of like, so atheists have to have at least a somewhat understanding of at least what they view God as, right, in order to reject it. But Peterson's point is that it is possible to reject something without fully understanding it. And I use the example of flat earthers all the time. The only difference is that flat earthers can be disproven empirically, and they have been. And yet, there are still people that legitimately believe that the earth is flat beyond all observational data and reason. And just like those people reject the concept of a spherical earth, they reject it probably because, and they reject it and they don't understand what they're rejecting, if that makes sense. So that's a nice little comparison. But Peterson's going to school him on this in a moment.
Existence of everything? Do you believe that Lono
I'll
is
answer
a
that
being?
question once you answer my question, which is, do I reject everything that I'm ignorant of?
Don't make that look at him. He's got a point. He asked you a question to clarify. Again, this is a debate. This is a problem that happens a lot in debates where people are so fixated on their own argument that they don't pay attention to what their opponent is saying, and they get caught if their opponent is good.
Because that's your presupposition that undergirds your argument, and unless you can prove that that's valid, then there's no point.
My question is quite simple.
Yeah, but that doesn't
Do
mean
you
it's
believe-
formulated accurately.
Do you believe
Teaching moment. He's teaching him.
that Lono exists? Yes or no?
I'm not going to answer that question for the reasons I just described.
Because he knows it's a
You already
trap.
insisted that if I reject something, that if I'm ignorant of something, I reject it. Do you think that everyone in the world has to know everything simultaneously for that to be valid and true?
I think in order for your
Answer that
argument
question.
to be true, in order for it to be true that we atheists don't understand what we're rejecting, then you need to also apply that to yourself and to Christians and to Muslims and to any other person on this earth where if you don't understand what you're rejecting the belief in, then you can't reject the belief in it. That's the implication of your
I didn't
claim.
say that I rejected the belief in Lona. I
It's-
said
it's
I didn't
Lono.
know who Lono was. I didn't
Right.
say anything about rejecting.
That's because I've asked you several times and you haven't, but
See, this guy really he knows his argument was defeated soundly, which is why he's trying to reformulate it in his mind. He's been beaten because his initial point has been defeated by Peterson quite soundly, as I just said. The point that he's making again is that if you first of all, he didn't get Jordan to reject Lono, because Peterson rightly pointed out that you can't reject something simply because you're ignorant of it. I mean, if that were the case, then we would never learn anything. Any scientific breakthrough would be rejected, and they often are. But they would be rejected without even having an understanding of it. Like, imagine the first time, like germ theory. Okay, germ theory, believe it or not, it was a theory at one point. Um, And the existence of, microbes causing illness was known before they were even observed, right? Just empirically. And then they were observed, and then it became, you couldn't argue with it. But so if his initial point is defeated, he's now trying to salvage it instead of just admitting that he was wrong, right? And that's, for those of you who don't know, the Average Intelligence podcast it's a joke, but it's also a statement, right? So the chimp in the suit is for fun, but average intelligence is, even though we talk about some kind of heady things sometimes and we critique art and culture and politics, at the end of the day, we're normal people of average intelligence. So when we're wrong, that's why I'm very proud of the fact that this and every podcast I do is when we make a mistake, I have segments called What Did We Fuck Up? I fuck up all the time, right? But I'm also constantly learning, and I like it when people point out when I've gotten things wrong when they're right. Because if they're wrong, I'll have a discussion with them. But when I'm pointed out in my errors, I get a chance to learn, and that's awesome. It's great. It's what I enjoy doing. Um, this for one of the things I enjoy doing this for.
Okay, so I feel like you're getting at this idea of polysemy, where we have multiple related meanings for a word, right? Like, for example, a famous painting can be emotionally moving in that it changes my emotional state. And when I was on the highway coming here to the studio, I was physically moving, I was changing my position. If I said, I believe the Mona Lisa is very moving, and you said, you don't really understand what you're saying, it's nailed to the wall, I would say that you're the one who doesn't understand what I'm saying, not the other way around. And the way that relates to this is there are many concepts of God, and
I see what he's saying, and I think I think Jordan's probably thinking this too, or I think he does. I would, or if I were sitting across the table with him, I would say, well, you're not wrong, because that sort of usage of moving is, it exists, but context is key. And I would call this the non-native speaker trap, because when you are describing a concept or an idea, even if it seems very basic to you, it is your responsibility to carry the message. And actually, Jordan, one of his 12 rules for life, sorry, I'm going to quote it verbatim. Let's see. Be precise in your speech. So, again, I've seen this video, but I wouldn't be surprised if Jordan brings this up. I would say, like I said, the English is a second language. Let's assume that you're talking to someone for whom English is not their first language, and you say the Mona Lisa is moving. They may not have the same context that you have, so you would be better off saying that the Mona Lisa is inspiring, or the Mona Lisa is a one of a kind work of art. The Mona Lisa is without comparison. The Mona Lisa is stunning. The Mona Lisa is intriguing. The Mona Lisa is, there are a million things you can say, or the Mona Lisa causes one to have an emotional reaction. I don't know what that would be because I've seen the Mona Lisa in person. It's much smaller than than you think it is. I mean, it was all right. Like, I'm not trying to say that Leonardo was not a master, but the Mona Lisa itself, eh. But I get what he's saying. But that would be what I would say to someone making that argument. So if you're describing something or giving an interpretation of a thought or concept or an idea, it is your responsibility to craft that message in the best way possible. So when you're talking about God, to bring it back, it is when you're describing these metaphysical concepts, you have to choose your words very carefully so as to not lead to temptation, no, so as not lead to confusion of concepts. And as Jordan would say, be precise in your speech.
time.
So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I see this is kind of goes back to where I'm saying initially.
I'm not defining it. Elijah
Okay,
defined
so
it.
as Elijah defines
It's
God.
defined that way in Jonah, too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also
got
defined it that
as,
way.
as I'm sure you know many people who've defined it that way, and it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm
okay.
just pointing out to you
Got
how
it.
God is defined in the Old
Okay.
Testament.
All right. So to respond to that,
Don't get frustrated when someone is giving you evidence that is contrary to your point in a debate. It's not helpful to you. It's not helpful to anyone. Peterson is that sort of reaction makes him seem very insecure in that moment because Peterson is rightly pointing out, okay, here's one example of how the Bible defines God. Oh, and by the way, here's another because he uses Elijah and Jonah and, Cardinal Newman, who I'm not Catholic, but I'm given to understand Cardinal Newman was influential in sort of not necessarily, teaching, but his views are pretty. He goes into Cardinal Newman a little bit later, but I'm given to understand that Cardinal Newman is pretty instrumental in sort of laying out how the vast majority of biblical insight was done. I could be wrong there, but that's sort of the implication here. But yeah, you notice he gets a little snarky there. It's like I'm sure you know plenty of people who it's like, well, yeah, because he's defeating your point. So don't get snarky. It's not a good look for anybody. Although to be fair, that's pretty light compared to what comes.
I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God. And that goes back to my
Then,
kind of opening
then how do we
statement.
specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, or again, it goes back to my example of the
I'm
Mona Lisa.
defining God as conscience.
Okay, so that's interesting, but then you're kind of expanding the meaning of God.
No, I'm not. That's how it's defined in the Old Testament.
Okay,
in
so-
Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever. So
It's not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the
Okay.
major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets.
All
Right?
right.
He's equal in stature to Moses.
Okay.
Right. So it's not arbitrary.
All right. So that is interesting, but it's not.
Another thing that I learned this directly from Jordan Peterson. When you're in a debate or even a conversation, it's perfectly acceptable to take a beat, especially when what you're working on can be edited. Take a beat, think about it, because he's grasping at straws right now, trying to come up with a way to counter Peterson's argument, but Peterson keeps reinforcing the same argument and clarifying when he makes a mischaracterization of Jordan Peterson's argument.
Not relevant to the context with which I am using the term God.
It's directly relevant. Atheists reject God, but they don't
Right, but
understand what they're rejecting.
you're
You
being-
accept conscience as a guide, and conscience is one of the defining characteristics of God in the Old Testament.
I think you're being intellectually disingenuous
In what way?
because again,
I asked you if you believe
hey,
that conscience guided you.
You just asked me a question and then you stopped me from answering it. In this setting, you understand the way I am using the term God and belief.
Not
and
in
then
the
you're-
No.
least. I don't understand how you're using
No.
it in the least. That's why I'm trying to define it.
He is assuming a presupposition here, which even when I'm just having conversations, this happens all the time. And if you have a goal in mind of furthering your understanding, believe it or not, I'm going to pivot a bit here. This is what I talk about movies a lot. You cannot assume. I mean, within reason, you can assume, but it's always good to define terms before you get into a debate specifically. Like, for example, you can presuppose to a certain extent. For example, if I'm debating someone who is a native English speaker, we can both agree on what a dog is, right? I mean, we can agree on what a dog is. We may very fundamentally disagree on what a good dog is. We may have different criteria. So we would have to come to terms and see if we could find some common ground on what constitutes a good dog. And we can't presuppose the other, because like I'm not a hunter, but this other person may very well be a hunter. So he or she may have very different characteristics that I maybe not necessarily disagree with, but I wouldn't say that is essential for a dog to be considered a good dog. So my point is, though, we may have differing definitions of what constitutes a good dog or a desirable dog, but we would both be able to agree on what a dog is. The mistake that the atheist in this particular line of questioning is making is that he is presupposing a definition of God and attributing it to Peterson's thought without even going so far as to define it. And Jordan rightly points out, no, I don't understand what you mean by God in the slightest because you have yet to be able to define it. So again, he's educating this person, helping him learn how to craft his argument better. And this was one of the parts where a lot of people were criticizing Peterson about moving the goalposts, but you'll see quite clearly he's not. He's using one of the definitions of God as defined by first Elijah, and then Jonah, and then Cardinal Newman, in that God is conscience, not conscious. So he hasn't changed his definition in this particular arena yet.
God as conscience is a lot more precise and oriented than your definition of the God that you hypothetically disbelieve in.
It's irrelevant to the fault lines of this debate.
How is it irrelevant?
Because in common parlance, when we're talking about atheists, God, belief, not belief,
I
we're
don't
not
care
talking
about common parlance.
Yeah. Common parlance can be wrong. Goes back to the dog example. Common parlance is good for really, really basic things like a certain kind of animal. Just the dog example again. I just said it.
Trying to get to something fundamental.
I think your point is irrelevant to the way that people tend to use these words. Your point that there are these polysemous
I didn't make
ideas
that
of God.
point. You did.
I
made a specific point that God was associated with conscience.
I just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
So I promise I will critique Peterson when he does move the goalpost. But this is one of the many examples people were citing about Peterson moving the goalpost. And it's like, did you watch that conversation? It was the person he was debating that was moving, or rather misattributing the goalposts and then trying to pivot, not necessarily moving the goalposts, but going to another aspect definitionally of what is God. And I think that's a point where I will defend Peterson hardcore on this one, because in this case, he didn't move the goalposts at all. He stayed very true, and none of the atheists he talked to could accurately define the God that they rejected in Peterson's viewpoint, and that they rejected because they identify as atheists. But moving on. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the video. Remember, like, share, and subscribe. But also, if you want to join in more of the conversation, you can check us out on TikTok with some of our clips from our better episodes and more popular episodes. And if you're not already on TikTok, you can click the first link in the description, and that'll let TikTok know that we sent you. You can find us on TikTok at Arate Media. It is also in the description as well. There are clips from the Average Intelligence podcast, the Arate podcast, the Final Frontier podcast, basically Arate podcast Pantheon clips there. So check us out on TikTok and make sure to use the link in the description if you don't already have TikTok. And now we'll get back to defending Dr. Peterson.
My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science.
I'm not going to stay on this one too long because I'll be honest, that prompt is pretty self-explanatory. There might be a little bit on it, but I mean, that's pretty basic, because science reveals the truth through observation and experimentation. But, conscience is not inherent within. Goodness is not even goodness is not even inherent in science. Science is not good or bad. Science is objective truth, whether we like it or not.
We actually have examples of Neanderthals, and older individuals found in a tribe, missing an arm, missing teeth, still alive somehow in his 40s, 50s, right? Typically, you're a Neanderthal, you can't eat, you can't hunt, you die, right? But we know that members of his tribe are taking care of him.
Find it very funny that other gentleman was nodding in the background. He's actually making Peterson's point here, or at least pointing to an ancient view of what could be construed as religious, or at least morality, right? That's not science. That's Neanderthals and whatever cultural or evolutionary element was present at that time.
We have examples of chimpanzees who actually have a basic understanding of fairness, right? If you give a chimpanzee 2 grapes, right, and his buddy gets 3, right? He actually freaks out, right? But you give both chimps 3 grapes and they're good. We have examples of parrots.
Except for the greedy chimps.
Except for the greedy chimps.
They want 4 grapes.
They want 4 grapes. You know, those do exist, right? But we have similar examples where we do animal tests, right? And
So morality is intrinsic.
I think
So it precedes science.
I think that actually
right?
a better way to define it would be that social animals, which
He's
we are,
educating
right,
him.
require some level of morality.
But that's not
or-
science.
Into what? I'm not disagreeing.
Sure.
Why do they require that?
Because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with
Sure.
regards to science.
For those who haven't caught on yet, Peterson is using, at least here and there, not explicitly, but especially here, he's using Socratic questioning to try to get the person he's talking to come to the correct conclusion on his own. He's asking these questions to get him to think about what he's saying and what he's thinking about and talking about, to get him to come to the conclusion that, oh, everything I'm describing comes intrinsically, which is what Peterson is arguing, not from science. Science simply gives us the ability to observe it.
Thank you very much.
Is that
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
how's that not scientific?
Well, because it's not derived from the scientific process, as you just
It
indicated.
doesn't need to derive
pointing
from the
to-
scientific process.
Well,
It's
hang
the
on,
fact
hang-
that
hang on a sec.
we are social animals, so we need that to exist as a group.
I
right?
agree, but
Sure.
you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not how
That's
that
my
works.
point.
Science explains it. So
No, science doesn't explain morality.
it doesn't explain how
No, it
social
observes
animals would need
morality.
to be.
Well, that's
altruistic.
a complicated question.
Is it? But we see it though.
Yeah, but explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality itself aren't the same thing.
My point
Okay.
is that God influenced slavery. People looked at the Bible and went, this is moral because God says so, just like women's suffrage
There's lots
and
of
just like homosexuality.
all human societies were slave owning, so you
Yes.
can't blame that on the Bible.
if humanity decided,
Oh wait, address that first.
What, about
All
slavery?
human societies were slavers, so you can't blame that on the Bible.
So this is one of the places where I mean, I'll criticize both of them because they're both, it's a problematic argument because for Jordan Peterson to be right, you have to, I mean, he's right in the sense that, yes, all societies were slavers until a certain group of people who were Protestant Christian for the most part fought to abolish slavery. However, there were also plenty of Protestant Christians who you know, use the Bible to defend slavery, as the other person pointed out. So in order for Peterson to be right, you sort of have to presuppose this idea, or at least as far as I understand it, you sort of have to presuppose this idea that the Bible says that slavery is wrong. However, God understood that, this is sort of headcanoning it, that God understood that humans aren't going to get it. So for now, it's at least probably a good idea to set guidelines on how to treat enslaved people well compared to the rest of the world, and then gradually it will go away. Unironically, not unlike the framers of the Constitution thought. That's problematic, though, because, again, if we Occam's razor this thing a bit, it does seem to make a lot more sense that just over time, as the person who's debating Peterson says, over time, human morality changes. The problem with that, though, is that we can point to religious trends influencing the morality of people, and given which that there are some places in the world that slavery is still practiced today. However, that is the extremes. It's certainly not legally practiced, at least not that I'm aware of, but ironically, certain religious zealots would practice slavery in the legal sense, and then various criminal organizations would, I'm not going to say secularly, but with non-religious motivations, so to speak. This is a really complicated argument that they're getting into, and slavery is honestly one of the best kryptonites that an atheist can use to argue against the Bible, because I mean it's in there, it's very much in there. And I don't know, but I am going to kind of poke Peterson a bit here because I understand what he's trying to say, but I think his argument, and this is very hubristic of me, I apologize, but I think that argument might need to be workshopped. Which again, this is a live conversation. Presumably, Jordan Peterson knows what his prompts are going to be, but he doesn't know how people are going to react to them. So you do have to think on your feet. And I think most people that are in the hot seat on Surrounded generally do a pretty good job of defending their views. I recall Ben Shapiro doing a pretty good job, but even he had some moments where it was kind of like, that's not the greatest framed argument, but people are kind of coming at you in real time. So this is one of the moments where I will criticize Peterson a bit. And honestly, I go back and forth on sort of atheistic and Christian thinking because trying to understand what the Bible is ultimately trying to say about morality. Because when it comes to religion, I'm much less of an empiricist and more of an ethist. I'm more interested in ethics, like I'm an ethicist. So I understand what Peterson's saying, where it's like the ideas present in Christianity in sort of the purview of it, or not the purview, but the teachings of it, can very much be seen as everyone has intrinsic value, everyone is in the image, every human being is made in the image of God, and therefore slavery is immoral. I understand that point, but you cannot deny that slavery is very much present in the Bible. So it is problematic, and I think Peterson does deserve some criticism here. But again, I think this is a little overblown because this is a discussion, not like let's own the other side.
If you're saying a description of your psychological preferences would be considered within science, sure, but I don't think that you have to say that it comes from science in order to be like an atheist. As an agnostic atheist, I don't know if God exists and I don't believe that.
I really don't like Parker. First of all, slow down. It's not a race. It's also oxymoronic to say that you're an agnostic atheist. Those are definitionally two different things. An agnostic doesn't have enough. An agnostic would say, I don't have enough evidence to prove or disprove the existence of God. Agnostic means without knowledge. An atheist is someone who believes definitionally that God does not exist. So to say that you're an agnostic atheist is the definitionally two different things, but I suppose they're similar, so I guess you can piggyback on them. But if you're an atheist, then you can't be agnostic. Like you can be agnostic and then become atheist, but you can't be an agnostic atheist because of what I just said. If you believe that God does not exist, then you theoretically, at least in your own mind, have knowledge that God does not exist. Therefore, you cannot be agnostic.
If you believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that. It isn't something that you say. It isn't something that's associated with logical consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action. And you're either fragmented, in which case you worship multiple gods, or there's some unity at the bottom of it that makes you an unstoppable force.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay. So then,
how would you define belief? Something you say?
Well, can I explain? Like, I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? Like, I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your life?
Don't be so sure.
You wouldn't lie to save your life?
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Would you lie to save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
Can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
I'll give you an example. If you're in Nazi Germany, and it is the case that there's Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them,
example.
Would you lie to the Nazis?
I would have done everything I bloody well could, so I wouldn't be in that situation to begin with. It's a hypothetical, and it's not answerable.
You can't answer hypotheticals?
No, I can't answer a hypothetical like that because
Did
it's
you eat
far.
today?
Look.
Did you
Don't
eat today?
play games.
I'm not playing games. I'm just asking if you ate it today.
If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing game. I just told you I would do everything that I could to make sure that I'm never in that situation. By the time you've got there, you've made so many mistakes that there's nothing you can do that isn't a sin.
Being born in Nazi Germany and trying to protect people that you care about, like there could be a Jewish friend that you have and you want to protect them.
I think you should
have
just
them in
give
your
up on
attic.
that line of questioning.
Give up on just like trying to clarify your position? Because
I
you don't
did
like, are you like
clarify.
uncomfortable with me asking this question? It's just a basic hypothetical. Like I could ask you.
It's just a basic
yeah, yeah.
hypothetical
Like,
where you're
It's not a
put
basic
Jews' lives at
hypothetical. You're
stake
trying
in
to
Nazi
trap him.
Germany. That's just a basic hypothetical.
Obviously, you would lie in that scenario to save their life, but you're like not trying to answer this question
What's
If it's obvious, then why are you asking the question, Parker?
for some reason.
I just told you why.
Are you anti-fascist?
What
Like,
does
so you're
that
Why
have
are
to
you
do with
asking
anything?
that?
I was just asking, just clarifying. But like, okay, again, you're not answering this hypothetical because you know it shows that you clearly would lie to save
I'm
someone's life.
answering it in
Obviously,
a
that's
manner
not
you
what truth
don't
is.
find acceptable.
Obviously, because I care about
you're-
truth.
I wouldn't be in that scenario.
Obviously, right? Logically, because that's
No.
already happened. Like that's in the past. You don't have a time travel device. We're bringing this logical hypothetical up to show you that in some circumstances that do happen within the real world, you would lie to save people's lives. So your definition of truth isn't actually how we're typically using it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to muddy the waters. When I ask
You're saying his definition of truth is invalid because you can't come up with a true scenario to test it, so you have to create one that's not only impossible, but certainly implausible. Because as you just pointed out, he doesn't have a time machine and can't go back to Nazi Germany so that he could lie to protect a Jewish person from being taken by the Gestapo. I'm going to dig into this a little bit more but I want to let you guys finish this whole idea because this is one where, again, people are really criticizing Jordan and they should be criticizing Parker.
you, like, do you believe this? Do you think this to be true? So you don't actually have to answer the questions. And plenty of Christians don't like that because they clearly see that you don't really like want to be associated with
I can
Christianity. with that
imagine
respect.
that I was in a situation where the best I could do as a consequence of my previous mistakes was to tell the least amount of lie I could manage. But that would likely indicate that I had made all sorts of catastrophic errors on my way there.
So
Right.
you would lie to save someone's life. So again, you do believe it to be true in that circumstance, even though you like lied in that scenario. So
Not
clearly that's
without
not what
the
you see to be true.
context that I put it in.
You were not willing to die for it.
said-
You were not willing to let other people die for it. So that's not what you see to be true then, seemingly.
You're doing exactly what I said you were doing at the beginning of the conversation. You're generating an impossible, restricted, hypothetical with no precursors to back me into a
How is
corner.
it possible? Is there something contradictory about it?
Ooh, okay. A lot of people are criticizing, and I can sort of, outside of the context of this debate, I can understand why some people were criticizing Jordan Peterson, being like, "Oh, you mean you wouldn't lie to the Nazis to save a Jewish person?" Well, I'm going to actually reference a movie that I hate, which actually encapsulates this perfectly. Inglorious Bastards, the opening scene, which I will admit, the opening scene is fantastic. That person initially, the dairy farmer, the French dairy farmer, initially does lie to save Jewish lives. But unfortunately for everyone involved, it becomes clear that I forget his name. I forget the name of the guy that Christoph Waltz plays brilliantly, but I forget the character's name. So I'm just going to call him Christoph. So when Christoph makes it abundantly clear that he knows that this dairy farmer is hiding Jews, he complicates the scenario by telling him that if he gives up the Jewish people that he's hiding, he will spare his family and his farm. Now, the farmer, and the actor does a really good job of writing this on his face, that he doesn't really believe him, but it's the only thing he's got. Because, as Peterson would point out, rightly or wrongly, that dairy farmer has put himself in a position where he now has to lie or has to give up the people that he lied for, and hopefully, and he's at the mercy of a member of the SS here, so this is not a good scenario. Hopefully, he gets out of this, at least temporarily. I don't recall exactly what happens. I think everybody dies, if I remember correctly. But it's fun. I just watched that scene, or part of that scene, not that long ago. And then we get back to the whole issue of Parker, and this is why I really dislike Parker. Parker, I've never seen Parker engage in an honest debate. I've only ever seen him try to trap people. and it's evident here. And he's so, ugh, he rubs me the wrong way. I find him disingenuous at best and just outright smarmy the vast majority of the time. He's not a good debater. His tactics are pretty common among, kind of like influencer political debaters, insofar as he talks quickly and tries to confuse people and then gives them implausible to impossible, hypothetical situations to try to prove that this person is somehow morally inferior when Peterson has the best defense for this, and he just outright refuses to answer it. But unfortunately, somebody like Parker just turns around and says, like, "Oh, well, you don't want to answer it." And this exchange also had very little to do with the prompt. I would like to point out. Now, back to the criticism. So, a lot of people are criticizing Jordan Peterson about saying that, to believe in something is to stake your life on it. And it does sound a little hyperbolic, and to a point it is semantically, but let's really think about this. Okay, do you believe in gravity? Of course you do, because it exists. But here's the thing. You believe in gravity because you can observe it, but you also stake your life on it. That is why when you're doing things like mountain climbing or rock climbing, you have safety harnesses because you absolutely believe in gravity to the point that, yes, you stake your life on that being true. You absolutely stake your life on that being true. Do you believe that you're bulletproof? I certainly wouldn't stake my life on that, no matter how much I wanted to believe it. And this is what Jordan Peterson is trying to get people to understand, and how he could have twisted it had he had time. I think he was trying to go here. So, if you believe that God does not exist, kind of a Pascal's wager sort of thing, do you believe that God doesn't exist to the point that you're willing to stake your eternal soul on it? And I think, honestly, there are very few people that actually would go so far, presented with that as a tangible reality. As the saying goes, there are no atheists in foxholes, for example. I think what he's trying to get to, which again I think he would have gotten there if he had more time, is that it's very easy to believe in something outside of real world consequences, but when those consequences manifest themselves, you find that there's a lot of things that people claim they believe in that they in fact don't believe in. For example, there's a lot of people who like to believe that what's a good example here? There's a lot of people that like to believe that they are, one with nature. I think finding themselves alone in the wilderness with a hungry bear or a shark or any number of predatory or just large animals, would they be willing to stake their life on that? Probably not. And I apologize, my brain's a little slow tonight. It is actually 10:42 p.m. at the time of my recording this, and we're getting there.
My next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it.
Yeah. So I want to start off with defining terms. How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. So almost like having a preference over something rather than the other.
It's a hierarchy of preferences.
Yeah.
And you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Right.
Okay, so I'm actually not going to spend too much time on this prompt, at least I don't think, because this is one of the legitimate criticisms. So I understand what Jordan means when he says that to worship something is to prioritize it. But he doesn't really frame that in a non-hyperbolic fashion, or he doesn't define it super well. So a razor-eyed debater will pick it apart, and some of them do. If there's anything very glaring, I'll put it in here. But like I said, I encourage you to watch the whole video. But actually, I do want to shout out. I think her name was Zena, or the girl that Peterson's talking to right now at this moment. She is really probably the only person in this debate, at least that I can remember, or this episode, that is genuinely interested in understanding and coming to a greater understanding of Peterson's claims and genuinely trying to understand them and not try to defeat them. And that's ultimately why, spoiler alert, he picks her for the end where he gets to choose somebody to debate nonstop for 15 minutes, which I'm not going to cover because it's a good discussion, but there's nothing really to criticize there because they're both doing the thing. And it's really fun to listen to, but again, there's not really a whole lot of debate going on. There's a lot of conversation going on, which is good, but I'm defending Peterson here. So, all right, everybody, we'll get back to defending Jordan Peterson in just a minute. But maybe you're watching this and you're thinking, I can do what this idiot's doing. And well, guess what? You can. You can even debate me if you want to, because it's never been easier to start a podcast, but there are still pitfalls that a lot of people think I'm not ready, I don't have an idea, blah, 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 all kinds of things. Well, we've got a whole network of podcasts, many of which we've helped start or started from the ground up, and we can help you do the same. So if you have an idea for a podcast, fill out the second link in the description. It takes you to a contact form that sends an email directly to me, and we can help you start your podcast. You can join the Arete Podcast Pantheon and not only meet a bunch of awesome new friends, learn how to create podcasts on YouTube, Spotify, various other audio platforms, get cross promotion. Every podcast can submit a commercial, or we can help create a commercial that plays on all the other podcasts to let people know that your podcast is out there. You always have a pool of guests you can pull from, and every year you are part of the Artie Awards, and maybe you can win Podcast of the Year. But you can't do that unless you start your podcast. So fill out the form, send me an email, and we will talk. But now back to the show.
Can you be very clear about your definition of worship again?
Attend to, prioritize, and sacrifice for.
Okay, that's it. That's your understanding.
That's a much better definition.
Well, I could flesh it out, but that'll do for the time we have.
Okay. Do Catholics attend to Mary?
Well, yes.
Okay. So do they fit that description of worship?
Yes.
So you would say Catholics and other people that revere Mary, like the Eastern Orthodox tradition, worship Mary.
Well, they might not put her in the highest
But
place.
you would put it that way.
No.
No. He never said they worship her at the top of their hierarchy. Like, his definition even implies a gradation. But this little twerp he's just the worst, right? And I don't know why Parker's laughing like an idiot in the background. Because yes, to worship doesn't always mean singularly, right? He's just saying that you have a hierarchy of things that you worship. Like, for example, we all to a point worship our jobs because it's necessary to survive, right? Doesn't mean it's at the top of our priority list.
Said it. No, you're taking it back.
There's
now?
still a hierarchy.
Okay, there's a hierarchy, but within
There's something at the top.
All right, you can worship.
Mary is quite a ways up the hierarchy, but not at the top.
Let's go over your definition of worship again. What's your definition of worship?
He already defined it for you.
Attend to.
Prioritize.
Do Catholics
sacrifice for?
What do Catholics attend to? Do they prioritize Mary over all other human beings?
No. I didn't say overall, did I? I didn't add that to my definition.
You understand?
I said there was a hierarchy as well.
You attend to
So you can attend to something trivially, or you can attend to it deeply.
Okay, now you're adding stuff to the definition. But
No, he's not adding to it. Attending to is not a singular occupation. Like, if you have 2 children, do you only attend to one of them? Like, think before you talk, man.
I added the hierarchy part at the beginning.
Are you
just
familiar?
didn't understand it.
Are you familiar with the Immaculate Conception?
Why is that relevant?
Because you go to a Catholic church, don't you? Or you've attended recently. You're interested in Catholicism, aren't you?
Sure.
All right. Are you familiar with their doctrines?
Somewhat.
Okay, you're familiar.
Doctrines are very
how do they
deep.
regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because
Mary is not at the top of the hierarchy for Catholics. She's up there, but she's not at the top. The Trinity is at the top. God the Father, God the Son, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. That's at the top of the hierarchy. Mary's not at the top of the hierarchy. Neither are the saints. No saints. None of them. Like, your point, this is even worse than the first time I watched it.
you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either you're a
'cause
Christian
I won't
or you're
talk
not.
to you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression I
private.
was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
That's not a. Okay, this is the one I really wanted to just dig into. First of all, I don't know why anyone's laughing because he just made a giant ass of himself. And I guess there are a lot of people that are like, "Oh, he owned Peterson, and Peterson didn't want to talk to him anymore." First of all, just in the area of civility, I wouldn't want to talk to his smug, smarmy ass either. And his motivation for doing so seems to be to get attention because I guarantee you, I didn't even know who this person was, but he does have a YouTube channel, and I guarantee you that after this, he got a bunch of followers, and there are probably still people commenting because I'm sure he's uploaded the clip and talked about the clip. He's going to be making a lot of money off of it, unfortunately. Um, he didn't show, because I'm sure he understood Jordan Peterson's definition. It was very basic, but he didn't show an understanding of the definition at all in his arguments to the point where at one point you could see it on Peterson's face. He's like, where are you even going with this? Because he was just trying to get the own, and like, he didn't get the own he thinks he got. I know that there are a lot of people who dislike Jordan Peterson that are like, oh, he owned him. It's like, not really. He couldn't even stick to the prompt. Like, and not to mention, there's just the fact that, okay, that kid is probably, like, I highly doubt he's older than 21. He might even be younger. He certainly looks it. You can disagree with someone, but I mean, come on, show a basic level of civility. Like, you ran to the chair to try to talk to him, at least have the common courtesy to sit down and have an honest discussion rather than just trying to get a one up. But that's probably why Parker was. It's not profound. It's not. He's like, you can't even show a even entry level understanding of his definition that you asked for, and you're trying to own him on that. No, this is very basic stuff. Like, you're trying to get him on, you're like, oh, are you a Christian or aren't you? In the context of this conversation, it's not irrelevant, but it's certainly not the top priority. It's not even close. It's not even close to the top of the hierarchical structure, eh? It's just it's not, because you're talking about Christian doctrine. Whether the person talking about, like, I can defend Christian doctrine without being a Christian. I absolutely can, just on the, you know, the beliefs themselves. Like, that's one of the hallmarks of being a good debater, is being able to craft arguments that you may or may not necessarily agree with, but you have an understanding of them as such that you can at least defend them. You may not win, but you can at least formulate an argument to defend even a belief that you may or may not have. So yeah, this little smarmy worm, I couldn't believe this. But of course, the YouTube is a wonderful place full of nuance and polite discourse. So this really shocked me.
Sure. So I prioritize and sacrifice for my wife more than I would prioritize and sacrifice for a random person on the street, right?
Probably, yeah.
Presumably. Do I worship
I don't know.
my
I've
wife?
seen some pretty bad marriages.
Assuming a good marriage, are you saying I worship my wife?
I'm trying to define worship.
Well, that's what
No.
I'm asking. So
Not necessarily, but you may worship the institution of marriage and the vows that you have agreed to with that particular individual that you've chosen as your wife. Doesn't mean that you worship your wife necessarily. That might be a little weird, but you probably do worship the sanctity of marriage, for example.
prioritize and sacrifice. I do
The
those
higher
things.
it is in the hierarchy, the more what you're doing is akin
You
to
certainly
worship. But even
sacrifice
in
for
your trivial
marriage.
acts of attention, you're
certainly
prioritizing
attend
and
to a
partaking in
marriage.
worship, even if you don't know it.
And
So
you
I am
certainly
very-
Part of
prioritize a
with
marriage.
regard to your wife, say. So why do you value your wife? You do value your
Yes,
wife.
I love
okay.
her, so I
Right,
prioritize and I
okay.
sacrifice for her.
Right. So that's within the confines of love, let's say.
Sure.
What else does it serve?
What else does what serve?
Your love and your marriage?
I mean, I am married to my wife because I love her. That's
Yeah.
also why I prioritize and sacrifice for her. I certainly wouldn't think I worship her, and I don't think anyone else would make
But again, you probably worship love, I'm guessing.
that.
I'm
Are you
trying to
making
make
that
a
claim?
definition.
Okay.
Yeah, that There's a hierarchy of attentional priority. And as you move up it or down it, depending on whether you think about it as a pinnacle or a foundation, you move more towards worship. Right.
Okay,
So,
I
see,
do-
I'm trying to define something. What
Right.
do you mean worship? I told you what I meant. What do you mean?
So I mean, something you worship is something that you have a reverential view for in a manner in which you believe it to be above and beyond normal things you like. Like you
So do you
presumably
have
worship
that
God.
attitude towards your wife?
I have that
Do you
attitude.
privilege her compared to other women?
Of course, I privilege her compared to
Okay.
other women, but I don't worship her. Nor does she worship me.
By the definition you just offered, yes, you do. Because you just offered a definition that involved prioritization and elevation.
Well, and thinking that she is divine above and beyond what a normal natural
women.
phenomenon can be. Not other women, no, beyond any human being could ever be.
No. See, again, this is where people get in trouble. So, by his own definition, he doesn't literally worship his wife. I mean, maybe he worships his wife. I don't know, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say, like I said, he may not necessarily worship his wife as an individual, but he certainly attends to, prioritizes, and elevates marriage, specifically his marriage, but in doing so, he worships the idea of marriage and love and family, um, a great number of things. And like for him to say that he wouldn't prioritize his wife over any other woman, I don't buy that. Certainly don't buy that. Simply by virtue of his wife being his wife, he prioritizes her over other women at the very basic level, just with attention, and not only that, and resources and all the other things that, go on in a marriage. There are things that you will tolerate. I don't mean tolerate in the sense that like it's bad, but I mean, there are things that you will tolerate from your wife, from your family, from your children that you will not tolerate because you can just leave from other people, i.e., a screaming child throwing a fit in the middle of a store. If it's not your child, you can simply walk away from that. But if it's your child, you have to attend to it because it's your child. I suppose you could walk away from your child, but then you clearly don't prioritize or worship the idea of parenthood. So, yeah, this is it's a weird one. It's a weird one because he's making a case for worshiping the institution of marriage by saying that it's not something that he worships.
I'm seeking to know whether I worship something. You've claimed I worship something, and I
If
want
you
to
want
know.
to have a deep and meaningful life, then you have to go all the way to the bottom or the top. And insofar as you're capable of doing that, because otherwise you'll be fragmented and miserable and anxiety-ridden and hopeless.
So I have to worship something to have a meaningful life. And if I
There's
worship
no difference between those two things.
Okay.
They're the same thing.
So if I don't worship anything, my life will not be meaningful, correct?
Well, that's the definition of nihilism.
Okay. So if I'm a nihilist, I don't worship anything.
That's true. And then you...
Okay. You just said everybody worships something. I think you've just agreed there is a class of people that doesn't.
Well, they're incoherent in their worship. And hand gestures like that aren't going to help.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Look,
They're
if you're incoherent and fragmented and aimless, which is what happens if your objects of worship are unstructured and chaotic, then you're going to be anxiety-ridden and without hope. That happens. That's a technical argument.
But there's happy nihilists.
No, there
are.
How do you explain that there are happy nihilists then?
There
You
are.
just said they
The
can't
mere
be.
fact that you state that there are happy nihilists doesn't make it true. Like, what's your evidence that, how do you measure nihilism and how have you associated it with happiness? And what's your definition of happiness? And have you compared them to religious people? Because if you do, by the way, it's clearly the case that religious people over the long run have better mental health. It's a well-documented fact in psychological literature.
Sure.
So your claim is just a claim. It doesn't stand on anything.
So you disagree with the claim that there exists even one happy nihilist?
I didn't say that.
Okay, would you agree there exists at least one happy nihilist in the universe?
It's not a question that has any meaning as far as I'm concerned, because it
Okay.
depends on what you mean by happy, and it depends on the duration that you're trying to calculate over. Now and then there's probably some deluded soul who thinks he's a nihilist who's momentarily pleased with himself. But as a long-term strategy to
few of
deal
them
with
in
the
there.
future, to get along with yourself and with others, it's sadly lacking. That's why Nietzsche warned that when God died, as he announced in 1850, that people would be flooded with pointless, anxiety-ridden, hopeless nihilism. And that was what would attract them for example, to the false gods of totalitarianism, which is exactly what happened, because everybody worships something, even atheists who think they don't.
And that is the mic drop moment that basically nobody's talking about. as far as I was concerned, that's case closed, right? Because I do believe that. I mean, I think that's demonstrably true. Nihilism, by its very definition, shows us that if you truly hold nothing in reverence or regard, it will lead to anxiety, unhappiness, as Dr. Peterson said. So, I mean, I think that point in and of itself kind of proves this argument.
My final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories.
So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
So then God doesn't fit within Christian ethics.
Okay, so I'm also going to touch on, and forgive me as I'm certainly not a pastor or a priest, but I always find it very interesting when militant atheists, they always seem to cite the Old Testament to point to God not existing, which is curious to me because the Old Testament, the majority, again, forgive me if I'm not precise here, the majority of the Old Testament are basically Jewish writings, right, from Judaism. And I should have, I really need to ask my friend, Rabbi David Grossbaum. I really should have asked him this when I interviewed him on the Arate podcast, which you can watch, by the way. I really should have asked him how Jews tend to view the Bible as it's my understanding that it's not always necessarily literal. In fact, rarely is so. These are stories about a people and their relationship with the world they live in and the God they worship and being the chosen people of that God. To point out to writings that are that old and aren't even necessarily, certainly not in a Christian framework because Christianity didn't exist when they were originally written. It always perplexes me. But at the same time, I will acknowledge that because many Christians believe the Bible to be the literal, unquestioning historical record in relation to the Word and the Word of God and the relation of Him and His people, then that is problematic. That is a problematic argument. However, Jordan Peterson is not one of those people. Jordan Peterson often cites the concept of meta-truth insofar as, like, it is true that if you trust in God, that you will be delivered from suffering. But I don't think he would say that he believes he cited the book of Job. I don't think he would say he believes that that literally happens, but that doesn't make the story untrue in the sense that what it's telling us is true, even though that literal story, because for that literal story to be true, somebody would have had to have suffered, not least of which Job, but also the family members that died, not to mention all of his animals and other property. So I don't think Peterson would die on that hill per se.
So in 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, go and slaughter the Amalekites, slaughter the men, the women, the children, the infants. What's the justification for that? Is that in line with Christian ethics?
That's a good question. I don't really know what to do with the terrible, blood-soaked, saturated history of the human past. I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. I mean, what you try to do in your own life, as far as I can tell, is to conduct yourself in a manner that makes such things much more unlikely.
So that is one thing that I think you can criticize Peterson about here, but not really, because he's admitting that he doesn't really know what to do with it, and that's something that a lot of very well-meaning Christians and atheists kind of struggle with. Even people that want to believe in the Christian ethic and all these things, you point to what is very accurately described as a God-ordered genocide, and that's tough. And once again, you can view it the way Peterson's phrasing it as sort of an example of the progression of human civilization, but I don't know that you could categorize it that way based upon when it was written. But you could also make the case that that's just how the world was then, and it was normal. It was somewhat normal. Or you could argue that it's a literary story, and in that language, it is not literally, in the context of the story, it's literally ordering the Israelites to kill everything, including the women, children, and even the animals. But that could be a literary metaphor for erasing the inherently sinful and undesirable culture that was once there and replacing it with the kingdom ordained by God, meaning Israel in the more literal sense. But that also gets problematic when you presuppose that the Bible ought to be taken literally, and you have to be careful with that. You can't just dismiss it. Because if you dismiss the fact that the Bible ought to be taken literally in every sense of the word, well, then you can very quickly get into subjectivism and the whole thing kind of unravels. Because if you can subjectively pick and choose and this is something that I struggle with on a personal level, if you can, there are things in the Bible that I do not like from my own more, and it's not just in the Old Testament, right? There are things that I do not like. But if I can subjectively pick and choose what I want to believe in, how far could I take that before, if I wanted to be a Christian, how far could I take that and still be able to call myself a Christian, if that makes sense? Now, there are different answers depending upon your denomination, right? But it's also not that simple, right? So it gets complicated. So I think you can criticize Jordan Peterson here, but I think you could criticize anyone sort of arguing on Christianity's side. And I apologize if you can hear those explosions. I have a neighbor that likes to shoot off fireworks in the middle of the night for some reason. I don't know why, but hopefully it's not too distracting.
Question, do you think that God is by his very essence perfect?
You'll have to provide more.
Sure, just like maximally great in all, like the great making qualities.
Sure.
Yeah, like flawless. Yeah. So,
okay,
so does a flawless thing change? Does a flawless thing reveal like more and better information over time, or would a flawless thing say, here's what's good, here is the absolute good thing to do at all circumstances in time?
Well, we know some of that.
If I were in Peterson's position, I don't know that I really have an answer to that, but I do think it's worth noting that yes, we can presuppose that God is perfect, but man's understanding is far from it. And you could theoretically make the case that God has to unveil his ultimate truth over time as our understanding. I mean, this is a really loose, I don't know that, to quote Dr. Peterson, I don't know that I would say I believe this so far as to stake my life on it. It's just an idea. But it is worth noting that God commanded in the Old Testament that they not have a temple and that they not have a king. And they end up doing both. And both end up being ordained by God. I don't know what to make of that, but it is an interesting sort of idea. It's also interesting to know that if I remember correctly, because you referenced 1 Samuel chapter 15 and the Amalekites, that Saul spares their, like, doesn't kill their king. I think some animals, if I remember. I don't remember, and I believe that's why Saul isn't permitted to be king, at least at first. If I hang on, so Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 soldiers of Judah. Saul came up to the city of the Amalekites and lay in wait in the valley. Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, leave, withdraw from among the Amalekites, or I will destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt." So the Kenites withdrew from the Amalekites. Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. He took King Agag of the Amalekites alive, but utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the cattle, and of the fatlings and the lambs, and all that was valuable, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they utterly destroyed. And then in verse 10, the word of the Lord came to Samuel, "I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and he has not carried out my commands. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all night. Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and Samuel was told Saul went to Carmel, where he set up a monument for himself, and on returning is passed down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "May you be blessed by the Lord. I have carried out the command of the Lord." But Samuel said, "What then is the bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we have utterly destroyed." Yeah, so blah 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 blah. Yeah, so Saul gets rejected as king for this, and this leads to the ascension of David. So yes, I remembered vaguely. So that's interesting to think about. I don't really know what it means, but it's interesting.
That's one.
That's totally fine, but
No,
presumably...
no. You don't get to skate over
because
that
this is a
with
straw
that's
man.
totally
It's
fine.
a straw man of my position. It's a straw man of the argument. So
In
the
what way?
argument is that God...
Wait a sec. You
Well, I'm already
said
waiting a
find
sec.
one maxim that's transcendent across situations.
I didn't say any of those words. I'm not sure what conversation you're a part of.
Don't be a smartass.
I'm sorry.
Seriously. I mean it. If we're going to have a serious conversation, conduct yourself properly.
Okay.
Educating again.
Rephrase your question so that, because I must have missed it. I tried to answer it.
So in my mind, I guess by my lights, a perfect being doesn't change. A perfect being, if they're maximally good, maximally moral...
Does our understanding of the perfect being change?
Our understanding might, but
Okay,
presumably what the perfect being is revealing...
Well, I agree.
Okay, he just made. I forgot that he said that, but yeah, he made the point that I kind of sort of made the point that I just made, that the perfect being doesn't change, but our understanding might.
We distinguish between that, though, at the human level.
How do we distinguish between whether...
Between our transforming understanding of perfection and perfection itself.
Between our...
We can only see through our own lenses.
Presumably a perfect being would be revealing all of these aspects all the time, especially if God's outside of time. I don't know how a God who's outside of time is revealing different things at different times. That just seems like incoherent to me.
Imagine something that's perfect.
Imagine that the concept of the divine is outside of your understanding. It's almost like they say it in the... Oh, wait, they do say it in the book.
Sure.
And complete.
Sure.
Okay, and it's trying to communicate with creatures who are anything but that.
Sure.
Well, they're going to get it wrong.
Sure.
Okay, now wait a sec. Do you blame that on the interpreters or the phenomena itself? For example, are you perfect in attending to your conscience?
Hold on. At the point in time when God is literally the one who created us, he could have created us in a way where we would always be receptive to these principles, where we don't have to go across like a learning curve where, maybe we'll understand thousands of years in the future, maybe we'll do it.
According to both Jewish and Christian tradition, we were created with an understanding of God. And then when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of... Maybe it wasn't the tree. Yeah, it was the tree of knowledge. Was it? Hang on. Okay, yeah, so it does, because it gets a little confusing. But yeah, they eat of the tree of knowledge. And one could make the argument that actually dilutes their understanding of God, but increases their understanding of the world around them. So yeah, if you're arguing from the Christian tradition, and we're presupposing for the sake of argument that this is either true or false, well then, for God to exist, then yes, you would have to argue that humanity's understanding of God was, or at least could be read as having been diluted after the fall from the garden. So yeah, actually there is a precedent in Christianity for that, and Judaism.
If there are other theologies and disciplines that have similar types of values, how then is that definition mean? Like, wouldn't those also be Christian values under your definition?
That's a good question. I spent a lot of time studying different religious systems from all over the world and found multiple interesting layers of concordance. Right. So, for example, in ancient Egypt, their god Horus, who was the reviving god of the totalitarian state, he was the god of attention, right? And the Jews hypothetically came out of Egypt, and there was crosstalk between Egyptian and Jewish foundational morality, and then that bled into Christianity. I mean, human beings all over the world have come up with moral systems that fit roughly into a pattern, and they're very usefully studied. Now, I learned a lot about Christianity by studying Taoism, for example, like a
Right.
lot. So I think you can make a case that Christianity formalized the landscape of good and evil more comprehensively and in more detail than any other religious system. And I think that that's part of the reason that it defeated paganism and spread so broadly across the West and is still dominant.
Ooh, because I forgot about that part. I was about to be like, ooh, he's about to defeat his own argument here, but he brought it back. He still kind of, you could attack that. You absolutely could attack that and say, well, if it was true in ancient Egypt, then what, then shouldn't we worship, the Egyptian pantheon? But I think he's doing a sufficiently good job at bringing it back, but that's dicey.
Still understructures our culture, for example.
The way you feel about Horus or Taoism or something is how I feel about Christian morals, I think.
Yeah, but how do I feel about them?
Well, that you took inspiration from them, you learned from them. Maybe
That's a good start,
Right.
because I would say that actually constitutes belief. Like you said, well, look.
Right.
In Noah, in the story of Noah, right? Noah is inspired by the apprehension that all hell is going to break loose. Okay,
Yeah.
he regards that inspiration as God,
Okay.
right? And when God comes to Abraham, he comes to Abraham as the spirit of adventure. It's inspiration. One of the definitions of God in the Old Testament, unsurprisingly, given the derivation of the word, is inspiration. And so if you take inspiration from Christian ideas, then insofar as you do that, you are in fact a believer, which was my point with regards to atheists
Correct.
not understanding
But have
what
you
they're
taken
rejecting.
inspiration from Taoism or from studying Egyptian mythology?
Definitely.
So then you believe them under that definition?
Yeah, but I've incorporated them into something I think that's more comprehensive.
Is it possible to?
Yeah, and this is one of the valid criticisms because, again, in the context of this video kind of changed because Peterson's not really outright arguing for Christianity as a whole, but he kind of is, like, especially with this claim, he's arguing about the Christian ethic, but he literally admitted that, you know, he took inspiration from Horus, for example, of the Egyptian pantheon, the ancient Egyptian pantheon. And by doing so, it constitutes belief based on his own definition. And he admits this, but then that flies in the face of the argument he's been making against the atheists all up to this point. Ironically, it works for part of his claim because he's making the case that Egyptian mythology and religious moral or aspects of Egyptian religious morality, I got to be careful because they're not the same moralistically, but sort of Judaism borrowed some potentially, which I don't know that I would make that case. Maybe, I mean, maybe this is a broad stroke. Maybe in the sense of they were aware of the concept of monotheism via Amun Ra. I'd have to double check the time though, because the ancient Egyptians were, by the time the cult of Amun Ra was, done with, uh, there's archaeological evidence that they tried to destroy records of it, whether that be art, the written record, hieroglyphics, and pyramids. There's evidence that they tried to destroy that. So I don't recall the time span, but if we suppose, for the sake of argument, that the Jewish people, that the Hebrews were inspired by something like the monotheistic cult of Amun Ra, then maybe, but I think that might be a stretch. And again, not being an expert in, ancient Egyptian religion, but I'm familiar with who Horus is, vaguely at least. I think that might be a bit of a stretch. So that's, and the person talking to Jordan rightfully points that out. Is like, so based on your definition, do you believe in Horus? I think Peterson kind of skates around that problem by saying he incorporates it, but because Taoism is a little different. Taoism, you could make the case, is less of a religion and more of like a, I don't know what you would call that, but I wouldn't go so far as to call that a religion. Maybe more of a philosophy. But his claim about the Egyptian god Horus kind of is problematic there. So that's legit criticism, but it makes the conversation more interesting, certainly. If this were not in the context of religious belief and more of like a how we got here culturally, that point would be perfectly fine.
Okay. But there's a Christian belief that hell does exist, and if I commit sin, I'm going to go there, correct?
Yes.
So what if I don't believe in that? Like I think that when you can I explain a little bit?
Sure.
That's certainly, it's not universal, particularly in early Christianity. So a lot of, and again, I apologize. It's been a minute since I've read this, but there's a lot of, in what constitutes Christian doctrine today, there's a lot of Anselm and Aquinas. However, there were several other schools of thought, and one that I particularly liked when I was learning all this was the theodicy of Irenaeus, or the Iranian theodicy. And that was a concept where it basically was Christian reincarnation, right? And basically, it was the process of soul making, and that each lifetime served to ideally strengthen the soul more towards perfection. The problem that many early Christian thinkers and Christian thinkers today have with that is that means there is no such thing as absolute evil, at least in humanity. That would mean that even the soul of that embodied Adolf Hitler, for example, would eventually be redeemed. Now, in a vacuum, that does seem like a very Christian concept, but it gets problematic when you start thinking about having to go to heaven with Adolf Hitler. But the Iranian theodicy, in its less basic form, would be that was simply one incarnation of the overall soul. That wasn't adopted, obviously, by the wider spread Christian theology, particularly that we know today. But that is, the concept of an eternal hell was not omnipresent in Christian history. So that's an interesting fact worth noting.
I picked Zena because I think she asked genuine questions and wasn't trying to win.
And for that final prompt, I really don't have anything to say about it because it was good, and he said it right there, and I wanted to end there because he, again, ever the educator, and that's sort of my main focus. He is trying to showcase what a constructive conversation looks like for everyone, and by choosing Xena, he is rightfully confident that he can do that. So hopefully you have or will watch the whole video from Jubilee. I highly recommend that you do. It was very interesting, very thought-provoking. And just think about it. I implore you to not listen without, what's the word I'm looking for? I encourage you to not just take the criticism of Jordan Peterson without watching the entire video for yourself and thinking about it on your own terms. And I would encourage you to look at it through the lens of him as an educator first and foremost, because that's what he's doing. I think it's pretty clear that he's, to the people that are sort of arguing against him, he's trying to, through dialogue and pseudo-Socratic method, trying to get them to better construct their arguments. He's outright dismissive of people that are using, how shall we say, not bad, dishonorable debate tactics. Disingenuous. That's the word I was looking for. Disingenuous tactics. People that are just trying to put words in his mouth. People that are trying to trap him in rhetorical traps that he refuses to be trapped in, and then they get mad when their trick didn't work. But anyway, I've kept you here long enough. If you stuck it out to the end, I thank you. Like I said, please like, share, and subscribe. Watch some of our older episodes. Send this to a friend if you think they'd find it enriching. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments, or even if you want to come on and have a spirited discussion / debate, we can debate certain points. I welcome that. One of the things that's actually disappointed me in the years we've been doing this podcast, we've had more than a few people say they want to come on and debate us, and no one ever has. And I truly do regret that. I had somebody in the comments a few weeks ago say he wanted to debate me, and I told him how to get a hold of me. Nothing. and I check my messages. But yes, this has been the Average Intelligence Podcast. Hopefully, you're a little bit less average and a little bit more intelligent. Most of the time, we fail, but tonight, I don't know. I think I at least gave you some food for thought. But stay tuned. Next week, we're going to have a special guest. Justin from the Spur of the Moment podcast is going to join me, and we're going to talk about what the hell is going on in politically around the world because it's chaos right now. But thank you for watching. Have a good one.